It's time for something different. It's time for GB News. I'm very patriotic. I believe in Britain. Our best days lie ahead.
Britain's watching. Britain's watching.
Join us here on GB News.
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Hello, good evening. It's me, Jacob Rees-Mogg, on State of the Nation tonight. The Home Secretary has railed against the Refugee Convention, which defines an estimated 780 million people, potentially, as refugees across the world. There is something fundamentally dishonest about this agreement, and if we are serious about solving the migrant crisis, it is time it was rewritten. Quis custodiet ipsos custodes, or who will guard the guards themselves? While the FCA was supposedly busy looking into political debanking and pretended not to find any evidence of such, it was issuing diversity and insurance and inclusion targets to banks and insurers. But wasn't diversity and inclusion the guise used by NatWest for debanking Nigel Farage? Of all the disastrous legacies of the pandemic and lockdown, perhaps the worst is the effect on Britain's labour market. Nearly 5.5 million working-age Britons are on out-of-work benefits, and new figures have revealed we're at the highest level of sick days in a decade, with employees taking an average of nearly 8 days off a year, and it's even worse in the public sector. Plus, whatever happened to the days when, as Lord Palmerston put it, a British subject in whatever land he may be shall feel confident that the watchful eye and the strong arm of England will protect him against injustice and wrong. Today marks the 1000th day of the imprisonment of British citizen Sebastien Lai in Hong Kong, as he faces spending the rest of his life in durance vile for the crime of being in favour of democracy. I spoke to his son earlier, who is asking why the British government isn't defending its citizens. State of the Nation starts now. I'll be joined by an illustrious panel this evening, alleged former Tory MP and criminal barrister Jerry Hayes, and the author and broadcaster Michael Crick. As always, I want to hear from you. It's a crucial part of the programme. Email me, mailmog@gbnews.com. Now it's time for the News of the Day with Polly Middlehurst.
Jacob, thank you. Good evening. Well, the top story is that the Home Secretary has said today migrants arriving in small boats have put an immeasurable pressure on the UK's asylum system and the British taxpayer. Delivering a speech in Washington in the United States, Suella Braverman also argued that being discriminated against for being gay or a woman wasn't enough to qualify for asylum.
Where individuals are being persecuted, it is right that we offer sanctuary. But we will not be able to sustain an asylum system if, in effect, simply being gay or a woman or fearful of discrimination in your country of origin is sufficient to qualify for protection.
Labour reacted with the Shadow Home Secretary Yvette Cooper saying the government have failed to set out any new plans to tackle the small boats crisis.
To try and target lesbian and gay people from countries like Uganda, where they face serious persecution, when they also only make up around 2% of asylum applications in the UK, is just trying to distract people from her own failure, where she should instead be getting a grip rather than ramping up the rhetoric and focusing on her failure to tackle the criminal gangs or to sort out the chaos in the asylum system.
Sir Ed Davey says his party would make NHS and cancer treatments a top priority if his party were in power. The Liberal Democrat leader told his party's conference in Bournemouth today that the Liberal Democrats will rescue the NHS with more GPs, more carers and greater investment in technology. He says he'll ensure cancer patients will start treatment within 2 months of an urgent referral and that they've been let down under the current government.
I still think we could be doing so much better on cancer. Far too many people are still waiting far too long for a diagnosis or to start treatment after being diagnosed. And I'm afraid to say they've been let down and forgotten by this Conservative government.
The Mayor of Greater Manchester has said he will take legal action against the government if the northern leg of HS2 is scrapped. Andy Burnham says Labour will build HS2 if it wins the election, because a failure to do so would be massively implicating for the north. The Prime Minister is reported to be alarmed by the runaway cost of the high-speed rail link, believed to exceed £100 billion of taxpayers' money. And water companies will have to return £114 million to customers after falling short of set standards. The regulator Ofwat says most companies are failing to meet key targets on reducing pollution, leakages and supply interruptions, while customer satisfaction continues to fall. Thames Water is the company that must pay back the most, £101 million. Southern Water is next. They've got to pay back £43 million. You're with GB News across the UK on TV, in your car on digital radio and now on your smart speaker by saying play GB News. This is Britain's news channel.
In 1951, following the Second World War, Britain became a signatory of the Refugee Convention, which set out the rights of those seeking asylum and the responsibilities of the signatories granting asylum. It specifically stipulated that it applied to those being persecuted for reasons of race, religion or nationality, membership of a particular social group or political opinion, quote, as a result of events occurring before the 1st of January 1951. In other words, it was particularly in response to the Holocaust and the other horrors the world witnessed in the 1940s during the Second World War. However, in 1967, this stipulation was removed, which meant that it applied to all contexts and was no longer confined to the events of the 1940s. But as the world has increasingly globalised, as the Home Secretary pointed out today, this revised 1967 definition now applies to hundreds of millions of people, and the agreement doesn't account for the fact that migrant smuggling has become a business of organised crime on a global scale. There's widespread belief that the main problem with our asylum system is the lack of safe and legal routes, and if only we had this infrastructure in place, we would solve the Channel boats crisis and, more broadly, the refugee crisis. Unfortunately, under the definition we are held to by the Convention, we could potentially expect to accept hundreds of millions of people. Now, of course, the majority of people that fit this definition wouldn't necessarily apply for asylum in the UK, but there's no denying that if we provided avenues across the world for these applicants, we would see huge numbers trying to come here. And two problems flow from this, two very practical problems. One, the domestic infrastructure, housing, hospitals and schools would crumple under the sheer weight of numbers. And two, the existing population wouldn't accept it. It would eject any government that tried to do this. And the numbers are truly vast if we had such routes. An estimated 40 million people are in modern slavery. 89 million people are displaced. 27 million people are considered refugees by the UN. In addition, the Centre for Policy Studies estimates that when you add all of this up, those who fit the claim to the Refugee Convention definition, it will be about 780 million people who could have a case for asylum in the UK. And this is patently absurd. And there's something fundamentally dishonest about being a signatory to an agreement that, if it actually applied, you would not be able to deliver on. And there are 146 signatories to this convention. But not one of them, including our own country, the United Kingdom, can possibly be serious about its full implications. The definition is so broad that it applies to hundreds of millions of people. But none of the signatories could accept such numbers. Surely, we want our politicians and our treaties to be honest and practical. Well, the only way we can do that is by rewriting the Convention, and the Home Secretary has done well to point out its current absurdity. As always, I want to hear from you. Don't forget to let me know your thoughts, and you know the email by now, mailmog@gbnews.com. This evening, I'm delighted to be joined by Oliver Westmoreland, a senior immigration lawyer at GSN Immigration. Oliver, thank you for coming in. Don't you think that if you have an agreement that is binding in international law, it ought at least to be practical?
Well, Jacob, I'm a lawyer. I see things in a legal way. If you agree to an agreement, you agree. I think the narrative behind what you say is that the agreement doesn't necessarily work. and you imply that we could rewrite the agreement. We can't. We're one, as you said, I think accurately, one of 146 countries that signed the agreement. The Home Secretary can make representations that the agreement doesn't work, it's not practical, but we can't rewrite the agreement. We can make representations as to why it's no longer practical. But as a lawyer, if the agreement is there, it's there, and the Home Office has to operate the agreement as it stands.
As it stands. OK, accepting that. Let's just hear for a moment what the Home Secretary had to say and then come back to that point.
Yes.
When the Refugee Convention was signed, it conferred protection on some 2 million people in Europe. According to analysis by Nick Timothy and Carl Williams for the Centre for Policy Studies, it now confers the notional right to move to another country upon at least 780 million people. It is therefore incumbent upon politicians and thought leaders to ask whether the Refugee Convention and the way it has come to be interpreted through our courts is fit for our modern age or in need of reform.
Well, the point, you make the very fair point that we'd have to get 145 other countries to agree to change it. But normally agreements have a means of pulling out. Is there any means of resiling from the convention?
Very easily, Jacob. The Refugee Convention was not embedded in British law in any really strong way. The European Convention on Human Rights was. It was embedded by the Human Rights Act 1998. The Refugee Convention was not embedded in that strong way. It was embedded here and there in some rules, tweaked. It could be easily tweaked out.
Because we have a dualist system. That we have international agreements, but they don't have domestic effect until they're passed by Parliament.
That's quite correct. We can sign international agreements, they're not binding on us until our Parliament has agreed to them.
And this is quite important because ministers can use the royal prerogative to sign agreements, but they obviously can't change domestic law.
Correct.
So are you basically saying that, not that you disagree that it ought to be changed, but that if we change it, we ought to do it in a legal and proper process?
You're absolutely right. As a lawyer, I try and be a technocrat. I try not to have opinion. I know a lot of lawyers do, and they become very famous lefty lawyers. I try and be a technocrat. I try not to have opinions, but we have to follow the law as it is. But I can tell you, if it was politically acceptable, we could withdraw from the Refugee Convention very easily.
So that's really quite important. And what mechanism would we use? Who would we'd have to tell the other signatories, or we'd just have to pass some domestic legislation?
I don't think we particularly have to tell anyone, really. But probably they want to know. But we can tweak a few immigration rules and things. We could easily escape from the Refugee Convention if it's politically acceptable, which is a political issue.
Well, let's stick to the legal issue, because this is really interesting, because often when people talk about international law, they think that it's like the tablets received by Moses, that
Indeed,
it's unalterable,
yes.
set in stone,
Yes.
governments can't do anything about
Yes.
it. But you're saying actually the government, if it has the political will, can do something about this in a very simple process.
Well, you know as well as I do, Jacob, you sit in Parliament, you know Parliament makes laws, makes primary legislation. There is no doubt that primary legislation is the strongest form of legislation in this country. Parliament can pass any law it wants. This will be a very easy law. It would be easy for Parliament to pass a law that we are no longer bound by the Refugee Convention. This could be done very easy if the political will exists, which might not, but it could.
And then this would still be compatible with our international obligations.
Well, we don't really have them.
Because that's the really interesting point that I think most people don't know. I think they assume that the 1951 Convention gives us international legal obligations.
Yes.
But you're saying they don't,
it doesn't.
Unless we wish to...
A lot of people, your green grocer, the person you meet in the pub, will think that it doesn't work like that. International law is only what it is. We are not signed up to treaties we've signed, really. If we wanted to escape from it, we could escape from it very easily. There's no legal comeback, not in international law or national law or anywhere.
And this is fundamental. So when the government says we can't do this because of international law, it's not actually true. They just need to do it. They could get on and do it. They could put an act before Parliament, bill before Parliament.
Absolutely.
When we get back after the party conferences.
The European Convention on Human Rights, which is different. That's been enshrined in British law by the Human Rights Act. We could make a new Act of Parliament. I'm not saying we should. We can make a new Act of Parliament to replace and rescind the Human Rights Act, and that's it. We escape successfully, and that is more difficult because the Refugee Convention has a strange history. It was only incorporated in a funny way over several years, and you have to go into case law to discover how it's incorporated.
Well, Oliver, I think that's absolutely brilliant. And clear, legal understanding of what we can actually do. Thank you so much. It's the most helpful lawyer we've ever had on my programme.
We tried to GSN immigration. We cut through to...
Thank you. I hope you'll come on again to be so clear. Anyway, don't forget to let me know what you think. mailmog@gbnews.com. After the break, I'll be asking my panel, are we facing the end of meritocracy? Plus, can the British government no longer be trusted to protect its citizens?
What you get for breakfast is something that, if we do our jobs right, you will wake up to news that you didn't know the night before.
It's a conversation. It's not just me and Eamon.
We want to get to know you, and we want you to get to know us.
From 6, it's Breakfast with Eamon and Isabel.
Monday to Thursdays on GB News,
Britain's news channel.
Nightmare commute. Kick it up a gear with me, Patrick Christie's, at drive time, 3 till 6 p.m, Monday to Friday on GB News Radio. You can listen online and on DAB+, on the smart speaker app and on the GB News app. And if you've got an Alexa, all you have to say is, Alexa, play GB News. We're also on TuneIn and the Radio Player apps. From the school run to rush hour, get revved up with me, Patrick Christie's, on GB News and GB News Radio.
Join me, Andrew Pearce and Bev Turner, Monday to Thursday, 9:30 a.m.
Who benefits from that? Not the British public.
And on Fridays, join us, Tom Harwood
and Ellie Costello from Britain's Newsroom.
That's what you get with this show. That's fantastic.
If it's happening, we're talking about it on Britain's Newsroom.
GB News, Britain's news channel.
GB News, unlike other broadcasters, isn't obsessed with the London-Westminster bubble. We think there's a nation beyond the M25, and that's why we talk about the issues that matter across the land. Join me on State of the Nation, 8 to 9 o'clock, Monday to Thursday, on GB News. Daisy's listening, and you should too.
People in Britain, they love free speech, but they also love fair play.
I don't care if I'm speaking somebody from a trade union, from the Labour Party, somebody from the SNP. And I think the viewers like to see that actually we can challenge one another, but in a positive way.
We think we ask the questions that people want to ask, and often we ask the questions that we wanted to ask in Parliament but never got the chance to ask.
So join us every Saturday, 10 a.m. till noon on GB News,
Britain's news channel.
First and foremost, I am a GB News fan, and I was before I was working here. Just love the fact that we're asking the questions that a lot of establishment media won't ask.
With a bit of a twist, we not only want to inform you, but we want to keep you entertained.
It's worth the drive because you get in and the team's all ready and waiting, they're itching to go, and it's a proper little family.
GB News is the People's Channel.
It's the audience that makes the programme sing.
We're giving our viewers and our listeners a voice. I see the thousands of your letters, tweets, emails, you name it, coming in.
Britain is broken. How on earth did we get into this mess? But more importantly, how do we get out of it?
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent you.
It's time for something different. It's time for GB News. I'm very patriotic. I believe in Britain. Our best days lie ahead.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Join us here on GB News.
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Welcome back. I'm still Jacob Rees-Mogg, and this is State of the Nation. You've been getting in touch with your thoughts. Jill, great speech from Suella, but it won't stop the boats. Matt, it's important we keep our borders open for those in need. Change the UN Convention would be barbaric. Ellie, we're a compassionate country and we need to remain so. Yes, but we can't take 780 million people. We have to be realistic. Quis custodiet ipsos custodes. You know this off by heart by now. Who will watch the watchman? Who guards the guards themselves? The question asked by the Roman poet Juvenal in the 1st century. But I suspect he may never have expected to be quoted in the context of the death of meritocracy, because he wouldn't have heard of the word meritocracy. The Financial Conduct Authority, one of the most powerful of the financial regulators in this country, disgraced itself last week when it released a report which suggested no politicians had been debanked, quote, primarily for his or her political views. But the report bizarrely didn't look at Nigel Farage's case, the highest profile one of all. Well, perhaps one of the most stark revelations of the whole debanking affair is that it showed how ridiculous corporate wokery is. NatWest, whilst it indulged in the sinister rhetoric of diversity and inclusion, proved that it had no regard for diversity and was quite keen on exclusion. In scenarios such as this, one looks to the regulator for help, specifically the FCA. That's its job. But lo and behold, it came to pass that the FCA, along with the PRA, have proved themselves to be as much part of the problem as the NatWest. Yesterday, it issued new diversity and inclusion targets for banks and insurers on the type of people it ought to employ, as well as developing a diversity and inclusion strategy and to collect, to report and to disclose data against the regulator's targets. This is the death of meritocracy. To get on in the city, you will now have to be a quota filler, and firms will face extra costly bureaucracy and additional committees and form filling to show that they're politically correct rather than financially competent. Well, I'm now joined by Narinder Kaur, who is something of a fan of diversity in the workplace. Narinder, why do you think all this workplace wokery is such a good idea?
Because I think every report has shown that diversity works. It's productive for any company, and it's vital for a community or any organisation to reflect their customer base. Why do you think it's not important, Jacob, actually should be the question?
Well, the issue here is that diversity and inclusion got Nigel Farage debanked, didn't it? It was exclusion, because they didn't like his political opinions.
We don't know if that's the case. I think that sometimes this meritocracy word is often used as a smokescreen in progressing diversity in a workplace. Would you agree with that? Because I feel like this, why can meritocracy and diversity not go hand in hand? It's almost as if you get diversity, therefore you're somehow getting less of a better person. And I think that's wrong.
If you have a meritocracy, you will get diversity automatically. You don't need to have a diversity and inclusion strategy. A true meritocracy does not need a diversity and inclusion strategy by definition.
But unfortunately, that doesn't always exist in the workplace. And Nikhil Rathi, the CEO of the FCA, has said in this proposal that actually data suggests that it's not working. What they're doing at the moment, it's not working. They are not retaining the best talent. They are not getting the best talent. And diversity is absolutely vital for their profits, actually, for the bank to do better. Remember, Jacob, this isn't about them just being nice people. At the end of the day, this is a business and they want to make more money.
That's right. The banks want to make more money. The financial sector wants to make more money, and therefore it wants to employ the best people. It doesn't need another layer of bureaucracy forced on it by the FCA, which is useless anyway, to make it employ the best people. They're very driven in the financial sector to make money.
Yes, but they do need this extra layer, actually, because this proposal and everything that goes with it, because it's shown that what they're doing so far isn't working. That customer base, everything is about customer base, shows that you have to reflect what's going on in your organisation to what's going on outside. And why would you have a board of, say, 10 middle-class white men coming to the same decision again and again and again, when actually diversity proves that when you have, women there, people of colour there, disabled people there, actually they come to better decisions for the community as a whole and for their customer base. You can't just have 10...
Surely the evidence is that you do best if you pick the best people, and that if you are completely blind to these characteristics, and that setting targets by the FCA is an appalling approach. It's reverse discrimination.
No, I completely disagree with that, Jacob, and I think you're being blind to the truth of the matter here, that actually these people don't always get that level playing field. We don't get our foot in the door. My son wants to go into banking. I know just by the very his name on a CV, he won't get to the top of that pile, and he's had disadvantages in that other people haven't. And I include working class white males as well. They don't get the advantages in life, and it's not a level playing field, Jacob.
Well,
you must understand that.
Thank you very much, Narinder. I've given you the last word on this occasion, but next time you come into the studio, I might have the last word for myself. I'm now joined by my brilliant panel, barrister and former Tory MP Jerry Hayes, an author, broadcaster, arguer with Miss Dewberry, Michael Crick.
Oh, yes.
That was quite exciting. I hope we'll be a bit better behaved today.
Well, I hope you'll be better behaved.
I will. I'll certainly do my best.
But you're always courteous and...
Well, let's not rehash
well
that. I probably shouldn't have mentioned
well informed.
But isn't the FCA and the PRA getting this wrong, that the financial services sector is the sector that is most driven by pure merit because it's what makes it the most money?
Well, I came into this studio thinking this was bonkers. But I've just listened to Narinder, and actually I'm reminded of the appalling things that have gone on in the past and the appalling ways in which people from certain backgrounds have had a wonderful, risen up the system in life, and other people from other backgrounds haven't. And like her, I agree that one of the reasons why we need diversity in all our institutions is to get the best out of people. And if you say, I mean, for instance, when I joined ITN as a trainee 43 years ago, and I only learnt this in Edward Sturton's book the other day, they had a policy at ITN of excluding anybody from the traineeship who hadn't gone to Oxford or Cambridge. So I was the beneficiary of an appalling discrimination against people from other universities. And I'm sure the same has happened with women, with people from ethnic minority backgrounds, people who are gay, and that shouldn't happen. Now, in this particular case, I don't think it should be the FCA that's doing it. They should concentrate on pursuing crooked bankers, which they're not very good at. Yeah. And no wonder Private Eye calls them the financial cock-up authority or the fundamentally complicit authority. Get on with what you're meant to be doing rather than trying to expand your empire. But it is an important issue, and Narinder has made a lot of very powerful points.
Jerry...
I don't think she has, actually, with the greatest respect to
Oh, no,
Narinder.
don't give me that phrase. You don't have to give me respect.
You've got it completely wrong. Correct. And the reason is people get muddled with equality and equality of opportunity. We can't make everyone equal. Yes, life isn't a level playing field for anybody, but give people the opportunity to do well and pick the best people. But this is discrimination. Young white boys, in school, they're falling behind.
That's what worries me. It becomes a means of discriminating.
Yes.
It also becomes a means of trying to pretend that other failings in the state, in the system, haven't happened. So we're not educating people as well as we should.
No.
There are problems with our state education system. Now, if you make it up by saying banks must have quotas, but that's not the answer. No. The answer is to improve the education system, isn't it?
Well, I think that whatever you do, it should be... You shouldn't just be picking on one sector, the City of London, and saying... and using their regulator to impose rules that you're not imposing on the rest of society. But I do think that if the state has to think carefully about this and certainly encourage practices that encourage diversity, and also you've got to be careful what you mean by diversity. For instance, in the past we've used the term BAME, and without...
We can't use it now.
Without and what has happened is a lot of Asians have done really well, but a lot of black people haven't. And so you've got to put more thought into it. But I think the intentions are good, but it's not the FCA that should be doing it.
But look what's happened in American universities, where they've actively discriminated against people of Chinese background, people from Jewish background, which is so disgraceful because they have had what they call positive discrimination, but positive discrimination is still discrimination.
But there are things you can do, like when you're, if you're the board of a bank or the nominations committee of the board of a bank, and you think, right, well, we've got 10 men on our board, shouldn't we be putting a little bit more effort into encouraging some women to apply? I'm not saying that you necessarily have to have 5 women and 5 men, but you put more effort into encouraging people to apply that your board is lacking, and they will help that board understand things that 10 men won't understand.
And that I think is a perfectly fair point, that you want to encourage people from different backgrounds to apply, but then you want to appoint the best person who has applied on their merit rather than to meet a quota that you've been told to meet by your regulator.
Of course. I mean, have you been, I don't know whether MPs have to do this, maybe ministers had to, have you been on one of these diversity courses?
I went on a course, the House of Commons, which said not to throw your stapler at your parliamentary assistant.
Well, that's a very good idea.
Well, I've never been tempted to throw a stapler
we all
at my
believe in staple diets. Let's don't be
What about throwing it at the chief whip?
No, I went to one of these because all barristers have to do it. And this woman said, this woman said, look, we all know that Boris Johnson's government are all fascists, don't we? We all know that. And I thought, whoa, just a moment. No, this is not what it's all about. Microaggressions. We have tipped the other way. We don't want to go back to the 70s. We don't want to go back to the 80s. And you just look at the sort of the casual racialism that was there. We don't want that.
But you see, that's where I challenge what Michael and Narinder were saying, because I think society has fundamentally changed. I'd be astonished if there were an employer in the land who didn't want to employ the best people, particularly in financial services. And I absolutely accept that might not have been true, almost certainly wasn't true in 1970. But it
1980.
or in 1980.
No.
But it now is, and therefore the FCA and the PRA, they're just a bit out of date.
Well, I
They've
agree
missed
with that.
the bus.
And they will find that many of the best people are, if not a majority of the best people, are women, and certainly many of the best people are from ethnic backgrounds, although there will be variations there, and something has to be done about. You have to think about how you're going to deal with that. So, in a way, they are a bit behind the times, and of course, a lot of this has got to work its way through because it's only perhaps people in their 20s and 30s where there's been more fairness, and they're not yet chairman of the bank, as it were.
But you devalue the currency. You undermine women because they say she's only there because she's a woman. You undermine black people.
I agree with that.
Because he's only there because he's
The
black.
other thing I think you've got to bear in mind is what you do about women taking time off for maternity reasons.
OK, we may have to discuss that on another occasion. But the one thing that does strike me is it's clear the best people don't go into financial regulators because actually you make more money if you do the real job. Thank you very much, my brilliant panel. They'll be back after the break when I'll be asking them how sick note Britain ought to get back to work. Plus, a British citizen and a freedom fighter has been abandoned by His Majesty's government and left to fester in a Chinese Communist Party prison.
Looks like things are heating up. Boxed boilers, proud sponsors of weather on GB News.
Hi there, it's Aidan McGibbon here from the Met Office with the GB News forecast. Showers ease overnight with clear skies for many of us. A fine start to Wednesday, but then Storm Agnes turns up with the potential for disruptive wind and rain. Still some rain going across much of Scotland and Northern Ireland, as well as Northern England through the evening, but eventually the showers become confined to central and the far northwest of Scotland. Most places will be clear then overnight. Some high cloud drifting in by the end of the night, turning things milder in the south, but rather fresh start to the day in Scotland, Northern Ireland and Northern England. Light winds at first as well, but Storm Agnes is moving in quickly by this stage, bringing damaging winds to much of Ireland before spreading those very disruptive winds into Irish Sea coastal areas by the afternoon. So after the early sunshine, it turns increasingly windy through the morning, those winds then peaking in the afternoon and evening. The risk in northern and western parts of the UK of 50 to 60 mile-per-hour wind gusts and around exposed Irish Sea coasts of 75 mile-per-hour wind gusts. So dangerous coastal conditions, disruption to transport and some heavy rain as well could cause impacts for central and southern Scotland. Much of that clears through during Thursday, but it stays windy in the north with the further risk of coastal gales, bright skies further south and lighter winds. Some showers still going on Friday. A fine start to the weekend, though, with high pressure building for a time.
Looks like things are heating up. Boxed boilers, proud sponsors of weather on GB News.
The Live Desk with me, Mark Longhurst.
And me, Pip Thompson. It's here Monday to Friday on GB News.
From midday, we'll bring you the news as it breaks, whenever it's happening and wherever it's happening, from across the UK and around the world.
Refreshing, feisty, but with a bit of fun too.
If it matters to you, we'll have it covered on TV, radio and online.
Join the Live Desk on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
So Jubes and Kerr, we tackle the issues of the day with real robust debate, both sides of the fence, battling it out with me in the middle with my forthright opinions and views. And often really interesting things happen because you start with a position and then by the end of the debate you find actually, well, I might not have thought about that one.
What we need in this country is 2 new political parties.
You should maybe think about doing a 2024 calendar. I'm Michelle Dewberry and I'm keeping you company right through until 7 o'clock this evening.
GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's watching.
Monday to Thursday, 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. Join me, Dan Wootton, for 2 hours packed full of unfiltered opinions, unique takes and fiery debates. I guarantee you blockbuster guests and exclusive reporting with no spin, no bias, no censorship.
I think there is a culture of collusion, quite frankly.
And no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton tonight on TV, radio and online. Monday to Thursday from 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. only on GB News, Britain's news channel.
In a world of dull and predictable radio and TV shows.
Oh, hi. On Mark Dolan tonight, we've got big guests. We drill into the big stories of the day.
The show adds up to a brilliant listening and viewing experience. Mark Dolan Tonight is the most entertaining current affairs show ever, and that's a fact. That's Mark Dolan Tonight, Friday, Saturday and Sunday from 9. Only on GB News, Britain's news channel.
Like all families, we have arguments every now and then, but actually we agree on what the mission of GB News is, and that's the most fundamentally important thing.
GB News provides the kind of platform that lets all voices be heard.
We don't hold back. We're free to say what we really think.
Just because some people who live in a tiny little Westminster bubble think that their particular story is important, that's not the most important story for me.
And often there will be difficult stories that you won't find on the establishment media.
Because what people think in the north of England may be very different to what they're thinking in the home counties.
We're going to carry on telling the world what life is really like for households up and down the UK.
We love to be in your car, in your kitchen as you're having your breakfast. Whatever you're doing, you are part of the show. If it matters to you, it matters to us.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News.
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Welcome back. I remain Jacob Rees-Mogg, and you've been getting in touch with your male Moggs. Stephen, what about a general referendum on the migrant crisis? I'm not sure what the question would be, and I think we know what people think. We just need to put it into practice. Robert, wonderful to hear a Tory minister stand up for the UK and its people for a change. I think Suella will have won a lot of friends from her speech. Mal, why can't the rules be changed to immigrants having to be able to demonstrate who they are to be considered for asylum? And Lucy, diversity is important. Well said, Narinda. Diversity is very much the way forward, and we should be proud of this. So Michael, Lucy and Narinda are as one. Now, this sceptred isle may not have entirely shaken off its moniker, the sick man of Europe. The number of absences taken by British workers because of sickness is the highest it's been for a decade. A study conducted by the Chartered Institute for Professional Development analysed sickness absence and the state of employee well-being across 918 organisations. On average, employees have taken 7.8 sick days in the past year, an increase from the previous pre-pandemic 5.8 days. It's even higher in the public sector. But I had a brilliant taxi driver today called David, who said to me, there aren't many sick cab drivers. Well, of course there aren't, because they're self-employed. They can't afford days off. However, this is not the only problem plaguing the British workforce. It is a lethal cocktail of sick leave absence coupled with some 5.4 million people currently on out-of-work benefits this year. But fear not, one local council might have found a solution. Cut the time of work down to a 4-day week at the expense of the British taxpayer, and then fiddle the figures to support a study saying that it's all worked wonderfully well, or perhaps not. Still with me to discuss this is my panel. You know who they are. It's Jerry Hayes and Michael Crick. Jerry, you're a barrister, you're self-employed. Do you take a lot of sick days off?
Well, I'll ask you a question. 47 years I've been doing this job. How many days sick do you think I've taken off?
Probably very close to zero.
Two. Because I couldn't speak. I had an abscess in my mouth. Because, I couldn't pull a sickie. The trouble is, and I'm not against the public sector, obviously, a lot of people say they have a right to take so many days off per year because they're sick, and it's a problem. I mean, it's a far better problem that we have than unemployment that we had in the 1980s. I think the government's doing their best to address this at the moment. They're trying to get people back. Long COVID actually is a bit of a problem.
But there's been something on long COVID in the papers today suggesting that there isn't as much long COVID as people thought.
Well, then the day before there was, we just don't know.
Michael, do you take an entitled number of sick days off every year?
Well, I'm self-employed as well these days. But when I was employed, I must have had about 6 days off in 40 years.
Yeah.
But apart from, I'm afraid, which ruined it, I was off for 3 months with a bad back, lying on the floor, and I couldn't do my normal. Although actually, even then, I did sort of research on the phone, lying on the floor. But obviously, I've been of good health so far in life, touch wood, and but
your body is a temple of God.
Thank you. Crikey.
All very well.
Live that one down, am I? But let me try and answer the question. I mean, clearly, there is a lot more stress about it. There is a lot of mental health problems right now, adults and children. And so I think a lot of the problems are there. I mean, you mentioned the cab drivers, also a part of this study. And by the way, these figures are only the worst in 10 years. In other words, we had this situation
that's absolutely true.
10 years ago, and they improved, and then they got worse again.
Yeah.
So, and one of the other things of the study is that people are more likely to take time off sick in big organisations than in small ones.
Yeah.
I suppose because they feel, well, the big organisation can cope. But of course, the more people take time off falsely because they're sick, the more pressure they're putting on the people who are still there, and the more that they may be inclined to do the same, or the more they may get stressful. So it's a very complicated situation. But I do think there is an element of skiving, to be honest. But I also think we've got to be a bit more sympathetic to some of the greater problems that people have right now.
But isn't this always the tough thing, that because there is clearly some element of skiving, therefore people who are genuinely unwell get less sympathy than they deserve when they are unwell?
Absolutely right.
And why do you think the public sector is higher still? Is it the sense of entitlement?
Because it's not their money.
It's not their money.
It's as simple as
or
that.
They may be. I mean, a lot of parts of the public sector, well, the health service, the pressures are enormous now. They're understaffed in large parts of the health service. They can't get enough doctors, enough nurses. You know, and we're especially so during COVID. And it's not surprising that many of them are sick and they end up leaving.
Money,
but there are lots of
money.
I know it's public money, and we've got to be aware of it.
But there are lots of private sector areas that are very stressful.
Sorry?
It's not only in the public sector that it's stressful.
But there are lots of public sector jobs that aren't stressful, and it's varied. Yes.
My job is stressful. There are barristers. There's only 2,200 criminal barristers left now, and the stress is enormous. I've been doing this a long time, but I've never been so stressed. I've never been so stressed. Michael and I have...
That's because you don't give that impression when you come on. You're very good at disguising it.
Well, we're all very good at disguising things.
But also, you're at a time in life, you see, where you've got fewer worries than you would have had when you were in your 20s, 30s and 40s.
Really?
I think so, yeah.
Really?
I think because you don't need to work, probably. You can more pick and choose. You try and...
Do you think days off relates to how much people enjoy their work? I mean, I've always enjoyed the work I've done, therefore...
That's why I'm doing it.
Yeah. And there's a lot of people in this world who do awful jobs, which it's very difficult to conceive of how you would enjoy. Well, and I'm sure if I did some of these awful jobs, I would be taking days off sick, or at least I'd be much more inclined to be genuinely feeling
to do so. But there is also the feeling of entitlement. You're allowed a certain number of days off sick.
When it's not your money.
When it's not your money.
That's the thing.
And you think your job is secure. Yeah. And it's maybe why the private sector has lower levels, because people know in a private company that if they don't do the work and the company doesn't do its sales, the job may not be there.
You've got to be careful, though. You don't want to encourage people to come in when they are sick, and particularly if they've got contagious diseases and actually infecting the rest of the workforce. The real dilemma is colds. You know, if you've got a really bad cold, you go into work, infect everybody else in the office, they all feel rotten, productivity's reduced. I always used to go to work when I had a cold, but I always felt a bit bad about it.
Colds.
Yeah, my children, that's right. You take 2 aspirin and carry on regardless, don't you? Sure.
Yeah, but if you're going to make everybody else in the office, if you're working closely with and they all end up having a cold, and as a result they don't work as well, maybe it would have been better if you had taken the day off.
Final word on 4-day week and then fiddling the figures. This is just a joke story, isn't it?
It was just stupid. It was Liberal Democrats. I say no more.
Come on, do you want to defend the Liberal Democrats? You're here for balance.
Not particularly. I mean, I think eventually we will have a 4-day week in this country.
The weather is very
but it needs to be thought through a lot more carefully, how we get to a 4-day week.
All right,
well,
there you
go. 6-day week.
Thank you very much to my panel. Coming up, today is the 1,000th day of imprisonment of a British citizen in a Chinese communist prison, and the British government hasn't even bothered to call for his release.
Monday to Thursday nights on GB News. At 6, it's Dubes & Co. 7 o'clock, Farage. At 8, join Jacob Rees-Mogg. And at 9, Dan Wootton Tonight, followed by Headliners. On TV, radio and online. This is GB News.
Now then, Lee Anderson here. Join me on GB News on my show, The Real World, every Friday at 7 p.m.
I'm not eating bloody cat. Are you
delicious?
mental?
Open your mouth. OK, here comes a train.
Reminds me of the scene in Singing in the Rain.
Adam, is that a good one?
Whoa! Join me at 7 on GB News, Britain's news channel.
Join me, Camilla Tominey, on Sunday mornings from 9:30, taking the politicians to task and breaking out of SW1 to see how their decisions are affecting you across the UK. Bursting the Westminster bubble every Sunday morning, only on GB News, the People's Channel. Britain's watching.
Join us every night on GB News at 11 p.m. for Headliners, which is 3 top comedians going through the next day's news stories, which is exactly what you need, because when the establishment has gone crazy, you need some craziness to make sense of it. So join us 11 p.m. every night on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Andrew Doyle. Join me at 7 o'clock every Sunday night for Free Speech Nation, the show where I tackle the week's biggest stories in politics and current affairs with the help of my 2 comedian panellists and a variety of special guests.
Free Speech Nation, Sunday nights from 7 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel. Every Sunday from 11, join Michael Portillo.
There will be topical discussion, looking at the week before and the week to come. So kick back and relax at 11 a.m. on Sundays on GB News with me, Michael Portillo. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I joined GB News because I was sick and tired of not hearing my views being represented, not just mine, but so many people that I knew and spoke to.
I just couldn't get my voice out there. I couldn't say anything. I couldn't do anything. Whatever the narrative was, I kind of had to follow it.
GB News is there to provide a voice for those who have been ignored by the establishment media. We think different things, we've got a different style.
GB News is here to be optimistic and positive about the future.
It's real kind of dynamic and flowing, with the audience very much at the heart of it, like a big family.
Here at GB News, we talk about the things that matter to you.
Hearing the voices from right across our towns and cities, especially our towns.
All sides of the argument represented with a heavy dose of opinion.
We're on a mission here to make a difference.
And the GB News family really is here for you, and whatever time of day you can watch or listen.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News,
The People's Channel,
Britain's news channel.
Lord Palmerston famously said, "As the Roman in days of old held himself free from indignity when he could say, si vis Romanus sum, so also a British subject, in whatever land he may be, shall feel confident that the watchful eye and the strong arm of England will protect him against injustice and wrong." Jimmy Lai is a Hong Kong businessman and British citizen, currently imprisoned in Hong Kong, facing life in prison for breaking Hong Kong's controversial national security law. Though born in mainland China, Lai escaped to Hong Kong at the age of 12 as a stowaway on a boat in 1959, when Hong Kong was still a British colony. He began working as a child labourer in a fabric factory. It wasn't long before he had set up his own garment empire with 2,400 shops across 30 countries. But in 1989, when the infamous scenes of the Tiananmen Square massacres made headlines across the world, Lai pivoted to the world of media and politics, setting up his own newspaper, Apple Daily, and becoming a staunch advocate of democracy in Hong Kong and a fierce critic of the Chinese Communist Party's regime. In June 2020, the controversial Hong Kong national security law was passed, criminalizing any act of secession, subversion, or collusion with foreign or external forces. Lai attended pro-democracy protests and called the law a death knell for Hong Kong, but he was later arrested in August of that year for alleged collusion with foreign forces, and he has remained imprisoned, facing multiple criminal proceedings since December 2020. Jimmy Lai's son, Sebastien, who is also a British citizen, has criticised the government for not explicitly calling for his father's release. As today marks the 1,000th day of Mr. Lai's imprisonment, I met Sebastien to discuss, as he sees it, the British government's abandonment of his father. Sebastien, tell me, what happened to your father? How did he come to be in this position? And what do you think the British government ought to do about it?
So when he arrived into Hong Kong, it was the first time he was counted as a person by any government. And he went from working in a sweatshop to eventually having his own factory, and then starting a company called Giordano, which did clothing. And all of that was going very well for him. And then the really pivotal point in his life, where he went from being a businessman to a activist for democracy and freedom, was the Tiananmen Square massacre. When the Tiananmen Square massacre happened, Dad was, and many people in Hong Kong were completely, I mean, heartbroken is too light of a word, absolutely shattered, because they realized that as China was liberalizing, economically they weren't going to liberalize socially. So my father decided that, it's all well and good being a businessman, but he was going to use his skills and his ability of entrepreneurship to further a greater cause. And he decided to go into media because he believed that information is choice, and choice is ultimately freedom. In '95, he wrote an article criticizing Li Peng, the butcher of Beijing, the person who ordered the crackdowns, the murder of all the students. He criticized him using very strongly worded, and I'm not going to repeat this on the show.
Oh dear, he used a wonderful insult. What was the insult?
It was a son of a turtle egg with 0 IQ.
Right.
And then he added that in the 5,000 year of history of Chinese people, it saddens him that someone like Li Peng would have existed. So as you expect, Li Peng did not take that well. His shops were closed in Beijing, and he was pressured to sell Giordano, the company that he had founded. My dad knew that he had a choice. He could either try to, he could either apologize and make a whole show out of it, or he could sell Giordano, make sure that he wasn't compromised. Because the thing is, if he knew that if he had business interests in China, they could always compromise him. And so he decided to sell it and go full in the media.
When your father set up Applegate in 1995, Hong Kong was still a British colony and freedom of the press was guaranteed. Under the Joint Declaration, which was the method by which Hong Kong was handed back to China, it was agreed that Hong Kong's way of life and forms of government would be maintained for 50 years. That would get you to 2047. And the Chinese have arbitrarily broken those guarantees, haven't they?
That's what makes the current situation so outrageous. This is a financial center that does not respect contracts. I think it really shows how Hong Kong and China views this country. If they're willing to step all over the agreements that they have made. They've called this agreement a historical document. Now, any contract, the moment you sign it, becomes a historical document. So I think it's worth revisiting our relationship with Hong Kong. I mean, now that this state has broken agreement with us, what are the consequences?
And your father is in trouble, really, for calling Li Peng a turtle's egg and for going on a march in favour of democracy, which was guaranteed under the Joint Declaration.
It's quite scary because under the national security law, which is incredibly opaque, he could face life imprisonment. But at my dad's age, even if it's 10 years, it could very well mean that I never see my father again.
What do you think the British government should do?
They should raise my father's case, a British citizen, at the highest level with China and with Hong Kong. They should call for his immediate release. And they should incentivize the behavior that they want to see. Do they want a state, Hong Kong, that just very cavalierly break agreements with the United Kingdom, or do they want to stand up for someone like my father, who was willing to give up everything in order to protect the freedoms that we all hold in this country?
Well, Sebastien, thank you very much. It must be so difficult for you. and your father has shown amazing courage in standing up for what he and many fellow Britons feel is right. Thank you. Well, thank you very much to Sebastien Lai for joining me, and I really hope that the British government will show a Palmerstonian spirit in standing up for the rights of British citizens. That's all from me. Up next, it's great Professor Daniel Wootton. Dan, what's on the menu this evening?
Yeah, what a powerful interview, Jacob, and it is so shocking, isn't it, that we don't talk about what's going on in Hong Kong enough, so well done for doing so. We have a big show, Megyn Kelly, Lawrence Fox, Tom Bell and Mark Williams-Thomas on the murder of Jill Dando. Who does he think did it?
Well, that'll be exceptionally interesting, and it's a most extraordinary story about the murder of Jill Dando, and I hope that the new programme gets to the bottom of it. That's all coming up after the weather. I'll be back tomorrow at 8 o'clock. I'm Jacob Rees-Mogg. This has been State of the Nation, and as you know, even with a hurricane coming in, I'm sure Somerset will have lovely weather.
That warm feeling inside. From Boxed Boilers. Proud sponsors of weather on GB News.
Hi there, it's Aidan McGibbon here from the Met Office with the GB News forecast. Showers ease overnight with clear skies for many of us. A fine start to Wednesday, but then Storm Agnes turns up with the potential for disruptive wind and rain. Still some rain going across much of Scotland and Northern Ireland, as well as Northern England through the evening, but eventually the showers become confined to central and the far northwest of Scotland. Most places will be clear then overnight. Some high cloud drifting in by the end of the night, turning things milder in the south, but rather fresh start to the day